is Cindy McDavid. I am the chair of the Greater Kansas City Interfaith Council, and I'd just like to let you know that we appreciate each of you joining us today for this event that's sponsored by the Greater Kansas City Interfaith Council in honor of UN World Interfaith Harmony Week. Now, World Interfaith Harmony Week is an annual event, usually observed during the first week of February, and while we are outside that window, we join the voices of others around the world to promote a culture of peace and nonviolence, and to encourage the mutual understanding and interreligious dialogue that constitute important dimensions of a culture of peace. The Greater Kansas City Interfaith Council has a rich history. For more than 30 years, we have worked to build the most welcoming community for all people. With directors representing 20 distinct faith traditions in the Greater Kansas City area, our mission involves engaging community, celebrating diversity, creating harmony, and embracing the sacred. In today's program, we'll take a celebratory and retrospective look at the history of ecumenical and interfaith work in Greater Kansas City over the past 100 years. And with that, I will hand it off to Joss Paskowitz, who is our executive director, to introduce our discussion leader today.
Well, welcome again, everybody. It's good to see so many people here. Thank you for taking some time on a Sunday. I have to say, I'm so honored to be among so many of you here today. And this is really an interfaith event that crosses a lot of boundaries. As far as our lead presenter here today, Geneva and I met each other actually in Las Vegas, of all places, at a Buddhist temple, not knowing that she would soon find herself in Kansas City working with our very well-known Reverend Dr. Vern Barnet. And since then, she's really embedded herself in the culture here, despite still being a world traveler and trekking across the United States, doing all sorts of different things. She can probably tell you how many interfaith councils and academic panels she serves on routinely. So I'll leave that to her, because honestly, it's an impressive resume that I have a hard time keeping up with. But we have a wonderful presentation for you today. It's a really fortuitous event for us, because as a council, we've been going through a strategic planning process over really the past 6 months, planning leading up to it and then getting through it. And this is going to really help us look back on where we've been. We've talked about doing this a lot to document it for the future and to then envision where we're going. And we've done a lot of that great work together, but I think getting a little bit more in depth is going to really help us gain some perspective and focus. So with that, I'll hand it over to Geneva.
Thanks so much, Josh. I'm going to share my screen with you guys, so just give me a second. Can everyone see that?
Yep, they're sharing.
Okay, great. So thank you. As Josh said, my name is Geneva Blackmer. My primary roles, I think, in relation to this conversation is I'm the program director for the Interfaith Center at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. And I'm also an at-large, from afar, director on the Greater Kansas City Interfaith Council. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the Kansas City Interfaith History Project. Just be a short 10-minute introduction, and then we'll move into the panel. So the Kansas City Interfaith History Project kind of began in 2016 during my undergraduate internship with the Reverend Dr. Vern Barnet. And, oh, there's my dog barking, sorry. So like I said, began during my internship with the Reverend Dr. Vern Barnet, who envisioned the development of a historical archive recording ecumenical and interfaith activity in Greater Kansas City, with the potential that it might be housed within the Kansas City Public Library system. So we began with a rough chronology of historically relevant and important ecumenical and interfaith events from memory, and compiled a list of local and ecumenical and interfaith leaders who would be significant to interview. So first on the list was the Reverend Dr. Larry Glott, who is also one of our panelists today. After conducting my initial interview with Larry, it became obvious he would be instrumental throughout the entire process. Larry helped further develop our chronology of events, creating what would eventually become the sort of working outline for my thesis. But due to time constraints and other priorities over the duration of my internship, the project remained incomplete upon my undergraduate graduation. However, I had the opportunity to revisit this again approximately a year and a half later as the possibility for my master's thesis. and receiving the support of my professors and advisors at Athens State University, Dr. Tony Moyers and Dr. Robert White, I reconnected with Vern and Larry and essentially recruited them to be additional and external advisors on the project. So the preliminary research conducted during the duration of my undergraduate internship really shaped the vision of the project and what it aimed to accomplish. In short, we recognized that extensive research had already been conducted at a national and global level, but little work had been published and reflected interfaith and ecumenical activity at a regional level or with any concentrated geographical focus. So this project would aim to conduct research specific to Greater Kansas City and would present this as a model for how other cities can engage in ecumenical and interfaith activity. It would also demonstrate the evolutionary process of how interfaith and ecumenical work can evolve in the United States and in the Midwest particularly. So while this content pertains to organizations in the Greater Kansas City region specifically, I would argue that it offers relevancy for any persons or organizations engaging in interfaith and ecumenical work throughout the country. So before moving further into the presentation, I just wanted to take a second to define our two primary key terms, which are also defined in the introduction to the booklet. In this instance, the term ecumenical will be used to define relationships between different denominations of Christian churches, and the term interfaith will define relationships between different faiths, such as Jewish and Muslim. So the index of the booklet was divided into 2 chapters with a total of 38 different sections. Each section provides a summary of a unique organization. So the first chapter spans from 1925 to 1980, and the second chapter spans from 1980 to the present day. I chose to divide the chapters in this way due to the shift from predominantly ecumenical work to broader interfaith activity, which was heavily influenced by the presence of the Reverend Dr. Vern Barnet, who founded CRESS in 1982. So as you can see from these slides, the thesis was presented in chronological format, and we felt that this was incredibly important to document the organizations in this manner to demonstrate the evolution of ecumenical and interfaith work over time. So it would obviously take me well over an hour to share my research about all 38 distinct organizations that were detailed in the thesis. However, I discovered there are many common recurring themes for why these organizations formed, and we'll explore some of these further during the panel discussion. As a disclaimer, I want to note that there are many, many reasons why ecumenical and interfaith organizations form, and this list, just as many of the entries that are actually in the booklet, are not meant to be exhaustive. Many organizations may also encompass more than one of these motivations for their development. The booklet begins in 1925 with the Kansas City Council of Churches. And this organization was comprised of white Protestant denominations looking to improve race relations in the 1920s and 30s. Even later renditions of this organization, such as the Metropolitan Council of Churches and the Metropolitan Interchurch Agency, routinely continue to address social justice concerns as their primary focus. The NCCJ, which was previously called the National Conference of Christian and Jews in Kansas City, it is now the National Conference for Community and Justice, focused on a wide range of social justice issues from 1953 all the way to 1998, spanning from race to class to gender and sexual orientation. So the active participation of faith communities in social justice efforts, particularly anti-racism, has been prominent over the past 100 years. We're all probably familiar with the second initiative to promote interfaith dialogue, education, and cooperation. This can range from organizations which facilitate academic inquiries, panel discussions, and so on, but it can also focus on relationship building, as demonstrated by organizations such as Sisterhood of Salam Shalom. Service is another focus area more commonly connected with interfaith work. Spirit of Service is a good example of an ecumenical network promoting volunteerism and community service from 1991 to 2002. Then, of course, some of these focus areas tend to overlap. For example, an organization like Congregational Partners, which formed in 1997, used community service as a gateway for interracial congregational relationships and partnerships. So we see service as a mechanism to address some of these social concerns. Of course, this is also true when we consider a focus on education and interfaith dialogue in general, and we could use recent programming from the Greater Kansas City Interfaith Council as a good example of that. Finally, we have media. This goal is probably the least obvious because we don't currently have the same barriers to media and communications that many of these organizations faced. But an example of this would have been Ecumenical, which was an organization focusing on increasing media access for religious leaders from the 1970s to the 1990s. So the two primary outcomes of the project were the Ecumenical and Interfaith History of Greater Kansas City booklet, which is available for purchase on Amazon. It's like $3, and all the and all the content is also on the Kansas City Interfaith History Project website. The website includes the entire chronology and summary of organizations included in the booklet, as well as scanned copies of some of the physical supporting documents that I uncovered in my research. For example, there are several copies of Informica, the Metropolitan Interchurch Agency newsletter, and a relatively extensive archive of materials from the Kansas City Festival of Faiths and the Hindu and the Cowboy, courtesy of Donna. The website also contains some of the original audio interviews conducted during the development of the Hindu and the Cowboy, which has been converted from cassette to digital files. And that's a very big project that we could potentially undertake in the future, is converting all of those. I also included an overview of the global progression of interfaith and ecumenical activity, beginning with the 1893 Parliament of the World's Religions to provide context for activity at the local and regional level. I think it's important to note that this entire project presents a mere fragment of what can and arguably should be preserved if we care about the legacy of interfaith and ecumenical history in Greater Kansas City and the countless leaders who served as catalysts for change in the community. But unfortunately, much has already been lost. So the reality is most organizations and individuals don't recognize that they're making history while it is actually occurring. So a large portion of the information that I compiled was only possible through extensive hours of oral history research, conducting interviews with those who held prominent roles in these organizations. So the summaries of each organization attempts to capture the following details. When was it formed? What was its mission? Who were the key organizers? How was it structured? Does it still exist? And if yes, how has it changed? If no, well, why not? Why did it dismantle? And in case anyone is wondering, the answer to that question is predominantly due to lack of funding and internal conflict, or the transition and absorption of the organization into something else. So I want to end by stressing that this is a living project. We're continuing to create new milestones in the present. And my hope is that we may begin to think seriously about the best way to preserve these stories for generations to come, which is why I would like to invite our 4 panelists to share a little bit with each of you that they shared with me. And I hope that this will be the first of many efforts to preserve the rich history of ecumenical and interfaith work in Greater Kansas City. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Josh to interview the first panelist.
Great, thanks, Geneva. And I hope that many of you will check out the website, if not the booklet too, that Geneva's put together. It really is a remarkable undertaking that has done a great job of stewarding a lot of our history that would have otherwise probably totally been lost. So it's a really great resource. So first up on our panel, we have the Reverend Dr. Larry Glott. Larry Guillot is a longtime participant and leader in ecumenical and interfaith relations activities in Greater Kansas City. He began as executive director of the Kansas City Ecumenical Library and Research Center, joint secretary to a national commission on Anglican Roman Catholic dialogue in the U.S., and he earned a doctorate in ecumenical theology in the 1960s era. He has a wide experience in human relations, community development, and executive leadership training, and for 25 years, he served as senior adjunct faculty to Park University's School of Graduate Affairs, teaching management of nonprofit organizations and U.S. social policy. He is the author of the soon-to-be-published life story of the National Catholic Reporter, covering the era of 1964 to the present. And with that, I believe, Geneva, do you have some questions for Larry?
Thanks so much, Josh. So Larry, I was wondering if you could tell the audience a little bit about the development of the Kansas City Ecumenical Library in 1962. What did this project set out to accomplish, and what good did it contribute to the community?
Sure. First of all, it was a physical building. The 1962 part was actually the formation of something called the Pope John 23rd Foundation, which was Bishop Helmsing of Greater Kansas City, St. Joseph Catholic Diocese, Bishop Wells, the local Episcopal Bishop of Western Missouri, and several laymen who were mostly Catholic and were supposed to have some money to help out on the project. But they soon got the idea it would be helpful to have a library and to describe the history of this ecumenical movement. That's when I was brought in and I was beginning to work on ecumenical theology. And so we launched the idea of the project. We started with some donated books, but quickly started finding, putting together a bibliography of all the materials that had been put together from those origins back in 1893, where Geneva mentioned the Parliament of Religions, and the 1910 was an early ecumenical conference that was held in then Sweden. The first World Council of Churches was held in 1948. And there was a National Council of Churches formed in the United States in the 50s. So there was a lot going on, and there had been an announcement that the Roman Catholics were going to hold a Vatican council called the Second Vatican Council, which had observers from all the other world religions and major Protestant denominations. So we had a physical building at 5225 Rock Hill Road, catty corner to the UMKC campus, because right from the very beginning, it was conceived as relating to the University of Missouri, Kansas City. It grew over the years to some 7,600 volumes. We had 200 periodicals, all the major ones in English, French, German, Spanish, that were dedicated to ecumenism. And we had a professional librarian, Marjorie Copeland, a marvelous woman. I would like to say just a quick word about it. Was the policies of the library were set up by a non-denominational committee that included Father William Baum of Kansas City, who later went on. I mean, he was at that time the head of the Commission on Ecumenical Affairs for the Catholics in Washington, D.C. He went on to become a cardinal in Washington, D.C. and lived over in Rome. Kenneth Labuddy was the director of libraries. He was on the committee. Rabbi Morris Margulies, a very wonderful Jewish scholar here from Beth Shalom, and who was the head of the Association of Rabbis in Kansas City, was on the committee. St. Paul Theology we had Dr. Carl Bangs, a world famous scholar in historical theology. And from Central Baptist Seminary, we had Dr. Alvin Porteous, who was again, a well-recognized theologian, historian. The Episcopal Church had Father Elton Smith, who was a local rector and head of their ecumenical commission. The local Council of Churches in Kansas City nominated Reverend Bob Manili at Village Presbyterian to be their representative. So it was a good committee. We had sort of a banner activity in 62 with internationally known theologian Paul Tillich was part of a program with George Devard, who was the best historian of Catholic work in ecumenical point at that time. Since it was about books and information, I'll just say one thing that happened, that over the period of time, we put together a very detailed bibliography of the ecumenical movement, and we noted on it which all books we'd been able to obtain. We also, Marjorie Copeland, the library, also did a survey of 37 other libraries and special collections in Greater Kansas City, and then extended it and did a survey of 27 other libraries that had theological holdings in Missouri and Kansas. So we knew how to situate what this collection was related to the library resource of the region. Then there was some question how to use this for the long term. We did have a lot of meetings in Kansas City, mostly local groups. Money was hard to come by for a project of this nature. And toward the late 60s, it was not sure that there was going to be long-term funding for it. So people began to look around. If it was going to go someplace, where should it go? And that's what led to those surveys of other library collections. So that's a quick overview of what the library was, why it came to be in Kansas City. It was the most detailed library of basically ecumenical, but it was also about religions, the study of religions in general, and did have other interfaith things as well as ecumenical holdings. And it was there was no such library, at least about the ecumenical materials, between San Francisco and New York as this.
Thanks, Larry. You told me in our initial interviews that the project ended in 1969, and I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about why it ended.
Well, it was the question of funding. I was also, I would say, in many ways, we were kind of naive about doing the project. I was young and idealistic. It was easy to collect books and things. It was harder to collect all the people who were interested and who would be willing to finance it longer run. We did a very, very elementary understanding of fundraising in those days. It was an early day for philanthropy in Greater Kansas City. Community Foundation was informed, and I think we have in the audience today one of the chroniclers of the early part of philanthropy in Kansas City, Jody Craig. She may have a question later about the early days. So it was decided that there was a little association of campus ministers that had Episcopal, Roman Catholic, Disciples of Christ, Lutheran, Southern Baptists, all had ministers that were relating and meeting regularly. And they were pushing really hard that the University of Missouri, Kansas City was the best place to have a program, an interdisciplinary program of religious studies, and that an ecumenical collection would fit very nicely in that. And they and others really then pushed for the library. At the same time, UMKC was building a new library. That wonderful library building you see down there, 51st and Rock Hill, was actually built in 1969. So right at the time when we were there. So in 1969, it was decided to move this ecumenical collection over to UMKC, where it currently resides. I don't think it entirely exists as a separate collection. I think it has been more integrated into the general collection of the library.
Yes, that's correct. It has been integrated. That was something that I accessed during the research for this thesis. So last question for right now. What is your advice for the Kansas City Interfaith History Project as it considers the development of itself as an organization and as an ecumenical and interfaith library? What could we do differently?
Well, it's interesting. I noticed that as part of the strategic plan being developed by the Greater Kansas City Interfaith Council, that there's been a question, would it be possible to set up a religious center or a center for information and for activity? So in a sense, we've kind of come back around in the circle. I would hope the first thing they would do would be differently and not be as naive as we were, and that you need not just to collect books and information, you need to collect people. You need to get the leading religious leaders of the area and the leading civic, and particularly those leaders that are related to resources, and get them involved and get them involved in the buy-in. So I think a detailed plan of what you're going to do, the finances that will be necessary, and the building of a strong program that is broad and has built-in would be the most important thing.
Thank you so much. Josh, did you want to introduce Vern?
Absolutely. Thanks again for that, Larry. We appreciate your sharing. So next up, we have the Reverend Dr. Vern Barnet. And Vern Barnet is known to many of us, I think, as the founder of CRESS, the Center for Religious Experience and Study, in 1982. That's some 40 years ago. In 1994, the Kansas City Star hired him to write a weekly column featuring religious diversity, which continued for 18 years. He is currently an associate professor of religious pluralism at Central Seminary, and he's an author, editor, and contributor to dozens of articles and several books. Binding Us Together, the memoir of Alvin Brooks, for which he was the developmental editor, will be published this Tuesday as part of Black History Month.
Great, thank you. So Vern, could you share some of the major accomplishments of CRESS spanning from 1982 to the present day, including Kansas City's response to 9/11 and the 2001 Gifts of Pluralism Conference?
Be delighted. Thank you for arranging this panel and for enticing such wonderful people to participate. I'm going to share screen. At least I'm going to try. Chris has been involved with literally thousands of different events over the last 40 years. I'm not going to read this list of major turning points, but I will focus mainly on one of the most tragic events in our nation's recent history, which is 9/11. So bear with me as I go through some slides. I don't think it's possible to talk about interfaith work in Kansas City without recognizing that we call ourselves the city of fountains. And water is such an important symbol throughout the work of CRESS. You'll see here on the logo for the Gifts of Pluralism Conference, interposed upon the world, interposed upon a tree of life, a symbol for Kansas City, city of fountains, city, heart of the nation. On 9/11, as the horror unfolded on the TV behind us, the Council's American Indian member, Stumbling Deer, senses us as our press conference that morning begins. Now, many of these slides have legends on them. In order to move quickly, I'm not going to read them. This is the one of the banners for the Gifts of Pluralism Conference. Let me just emphasize that it was a conference for shaping the future of religion in the Kansas City area for everyone interested in learning about world religions and how they address environmental, personal, and social issues of our time using the appreciative inquiry method. This is the front page of the faith section, which uses our logo. A lovely story about the conference. This appeared just before the conference. And of course, the story continued on for several pages. Happy birthday, David Nelson. Today is David's birthday. Here he is greeting people at the beginning of the conference. people of all ages. Notice the container of water and the candles. We had good participation from government and civic leaders. Some of you are familiar with the book for healthcare workers, inspired and begun by Steve Jeffers. Many displays. And this is one of many copies of the Gifts of Pluralism concluding conference declaration. And we had people sign after it had been, the wording of it had been perfected. And it was later published in the Kansas City Star, the complete conference declaration. And a lovely editorial about the conference appeared on November 1. Just to emphasize the importance of water as a symbol, at the National Interfaith Academies arranged by Harvard's Pluralism Project, Religions for Peace at the UN Plaza, the Interfaith Council and the St. Paul School of Theology under the auspices of CRES also concluded with a water ceremony. So I feel very strongly that water symbolism is so important. It's found in almost every, well, in every faith, and has so many different meanings, as that will become clearer as we go along. I'm not going to point out the different images here, all taken on September 11, 2002, with the first ceremony beginning in darkness as members of the Interfaith Council boarded a bus at Grace and Holy Trinity Cathedral, each bringing a vessel of water to pour then into the pool after the bus dropped us off at City Hall into the pool at Ilis Davis Park. And then the water was mingled in the pool, and then the mingled water was gathered, and with police escort, we walked back to the cathedral where in the evening ceremonies were held with the opera, the ballet, and the symphony. And Mayor Barnes and other dignitaries spoke. The children, Jewish and Muslim children, sang songs of peace together. And at the very last photo, the mingled water was parceled out to each member of the Interfaith Council to take back to his or her own community. That morning, recognizing the disaster that we were observing that happened 1 year earlier, we spoke words something like this, that people of many faiths were killed by the terrorists, and our lamentations resulted in our tears. Tears, water, are an honorable part of our response to the horrors of that time. In our common grief, we become united. But then it was time, as it always is, to transform the water of tears into the waters of purification, renewal, and refreshment. Holy waters can be extinguished. Holy waters can extinguish the fires of hatred, wash away our self-righteousness, and well up as healing fountains of the heart. Just a couple more things. Want to point out that every month we published a monthly newsletter, 12 pages, color, rich with stories, not just about our activities, but about other activities by other organizations in the community. So there's a lot of Kansas City history. And there was a special insert each month. This particular insert was resources for Earth Day. And finally, I want to mention the early use of technology. In 1997, we began a website which contains an enormous amount of resource material, just ready to be used, and we're grateful that it is being used. Just a quick word about our mission. We see the Families of Faith as a research project in 3 families: primal, Asian, and monotheistic. We see that each of them addresses our corrupted community, the endangered environment, and personhood violated, with an answer that shows us true community, restored nature, and wholesome personhood. And we have given examples of the crises of secularism and how our world would be if we used this wisdom, which was identified and reworded by the Gifts of Pluralism Conference from the 3 families of faith. And you can find a full chart on our website which summarizes that wisdom.
Thank you so much, Vern. And thank you for sharing all those images and the slides of your newsletter. I think you just presented a really good example of the type of documents and media we could be preserving through an ecumenical and interfaith archive. So I was wondering if you could answer this following question. What do you think is the same or different about the culture of interfaith work in Kansas City that allowed to the projects you just demonstrated to flourish?
Sure. These are the items I would list. In Kansas City, there was cultural and local groundwork done. For example, an early conference held at Rockhurst by the Kansas City Press Club, along with CRESS and several other organizations, which really revamped both electronic and, for a time, print media coverage of religion. So that generated a groundwork, a fertile field in which interfaith could grow. We had in Kansas City adequate and excellent representation from a dozen major world religions, from A to Z, as I never tire of saying, A to Z, American Indian to Zoroastrian. Also, Kansas City is a grounded place here in the Midwest. We don't have a lot of crazies, a few maybe, but we're not like what we read about in those days in California and even on the East Coast. And finally, the metro was small enough for people to know each other yet big enough for there to be substantial expertise, including the academy, which Larry rightly mentioned as so important, and the arts. And at that time, we also had competent political leaders.
Thank you, Vern. What do you think the history of CRES offers us for the future? What are the biggest lessons or recommendations that we can take away moving forward?
These are my suggestions forward. I'd be glad to take any questions about them when all the panelists have a chance to speak. I will read these and then I'll shut up. Interfaith must be more than respecting many faiths. It must address the overwhelming crises of our time in the environment, personhood, and the social order with the wisdom from the world's traditions. It does this best by asking always, what is sacred? What is it on which our lives depend? If interfaith fails to address people's concerns, it is shallow, it's a feel-good experience. Focusing on similarities rather than on differences deprives us of the rich wisdom we need to learn from one another and to put into action. That's my first point. Secondly, symbols like, take the Kansas City symbol, a city of fountains. Symbols and ritual are more important in programs than often thought and can provide continuity and profound meaning with rich and strong associations. That's why at CRES we use those symbols over and over again. Every time we use them, we get another layer of meaning. 3, interfaith is best grounded both academically and in the community. Public, civic, and artistic engagement is necessary for progress and legitimacy. 4, interfaith efforts are most effective when they cooperate, that is, organizations cooperate while respecting their separate and distinct spheres. And finally, participation should be wide open, but governing bodies of the various organizations need generally to be composed of recognized leaders of main rather than splinter or non-distinct faith groups. Thank you for your excellent questions, Geneva, and I look forward to the rest of the panel.
Thank you for sharing, Vern. I remember the first time I met your son, Ben, he gave me your website address. And as you were speaking and saying that that was a major resource, I remember my mouth literally dropping open at the time I looked it up, thinking what a remarkable amount of information was stored there. So like some of the other resources that have been noted, anybody with an interest in Kansas City interfaith history would do well to check out CRES.org. So up next on our panel, we have Maggie Frienrock. Maggie is currently Chief Learning Officer of the Learning Project, an organizational development firm based in Kansas City, but working internationally to create high-achieving, diverse, and dynamic learning organizations, bridging people, cultures, ideas, and resources throughout the known universe. Maggie is the former director and a founding member of Harmony in a World of Difference, a multifaceted campaign to improve race relations, eliminate bias and discrimination, and increase respect and skills for diversity. She works as senior advisor and trainer for the Reach Center in Seattle, Washington, and the Anti-Defamation League in New York. Diverse clients include city governments, banking, judges, newspapers, healthcare, police and fire departments, intelligence agencies, state boards of education, school systems, universities, nonprofit organizations, religious institutions, national recreation cooperatives, art institutions, and corporate clients including AT&T, Corning, DuPont, Johnson & Johnson, and Procter & Gamble. Group mediation is a large part of Maggie's work at the Learning Project, which has taken her to all 50 states and Canada, Mexico, Asia, Australia, Africa, and Europe. Maggie is the author of Pilgrimage of the Heart, Mountains Diminish Underfoot, The Art and Ministry of Teaching, and The Art and Heart of Diversity, alongside, she notes, lots of other published, unpublished, and perhaps even unpublishable poetry, photography, and articles.
Thank you, Josh. Maggie, as Josh just mentioned, you were one of the first co-directors for Harmony and a World of Difference in 1989. What did this project aim to accomplish, and what good did it contribute to the community?
Well, thank you. And I've learned a lot just listening to you all. This has been like a walk through history and a walk through Kansas City. It reminded me of things that I've forgotten. So the official, for Harmony and a World of Difference, the official goal is that, I'm going to try to do the real one, a multi-dimensional community process that was initiated in 1989 to improve race relations, increase appreciation for cultural diversity, and reduce prejudice and bias in the metropolitan area. So that was the target goal, was 1 million people in the metropolitan area. It did that from a four-pronged approach. And this is an approach I really like and I think could be replicated in other places. So one is through education. There was training and resources in multicultural education and cultural diversity and cross-cultural competency and anti-racism for schools and businesses and agencies. And it was all adapted for each agency that we did. There was a funded study guide, which Vern wrote and participated, wrote the religious diversity section with the ethnic histories of all Kansas City groups, many Kansas City groups, and then resources that people could use, still in use today. So that was the education component in brief. And then the media component was through our partner of Channel 9. We had documentaries and forums and public service announcements and all sorts of programming. Even there was a children's show at one point. So there were a lot of things that were done. So Channel 9, our KMBC affiliate, did a tremendous job in getting the information out across that 1 million people. The third component was an alliance. So we took, at that time, all the civil rights, human rights, interested groups in religious and cultural diversity and formed an alliance. So we met, we shared resources, we looked at what other people were doing, how we could support them, co-sponsored events. And then that group also did events of their own. There's a pledge and a commitment card that thousands and thousands of people signed. And then there was one for youth and then one for educators. There were dinners. Then all sorts of interesting, innovative projects came off of that. Unplanned, like dinners for 8, 9, and 10 people would get together across differences, speakers bureaus, forums, all sorts of events, community events and festivals. So it really brought people together and built relationships to work together. Then the fourth component was task forces or covenant groups. That's people in religion, media, real estate, law, justice, business. They formed alliances within their field of work to sign covenants, to follow through with systemic pieces to increase respect for diversity and end prejudice and discrimination. So it's a four-pronged approach to do that. I could go on forever, so you ask me another question.
Well, let's move into the next question. In what ways was Harmony successful in improving race relations in Kansas City? And in what ways did it fail?
Well, I think that's yet to be seen, but one anecdotal story in 1993, Kansas City was selected to as one of the All-America cities. So we had to go to Oakland to vie for an award. And I was really excited to go. So Harmony was a part of that, and Combat was a part of that, our drug program. So I was really excited to go, mainly, not for the award so much as I wanted to talk to all these other cities across the country who were, I wanted to see what they were doing in race relations, what they were doing in diversity, what they were doing in religious diversity. What could we learn from them? And so much to my great surprise is in that forum, we were farther along than anyone. Nobody else was doing anything similar to this. And I was greatly disappointed. I thought, that we had started in 88, 89, perhaps a lot of people were farther, beyond, to a community-wide approach to look at these issues from a variety of backgrounds. So I think Harmony in a World of Difference has been very successful in building relationships, developing leaders, putting the skills in the community, that people have the skills. Now, those skills have to be revisited and brought into this current work and deepened and broadened. But I do think I think about 1 million people were affected, and then on different levels. Some people got very involved and got extensive training and extensive systemic work. And now our interfaith, cultural competency, anti-racism, cultural diversity, inclusion, and equity leaders throughout the world. That's one of the things I love. And also, what I noticed is relationships were built so that when conflicts arise, people would pick up the phone and say, "Hey, Vern, we need to talk. This is not good." You know, instead of there being dysfunctional conflict, that people had built enough relationships and enough trust that people would walk across lines to do that. That was good. I think one of the pieces that people don't know in whether it failed or succeeded is that the process, it actually was designed as a project, as an 18-month process. So it was a campaign, and you know that TV, so this was designed as an 18-month project because TV stations usually do an 18-month community campaign. And so we hit the ground running, knowing that the funding, everything would close down after 18 months. Well, indeed, in 1989, 90, the city of Kansas City would not let it shut down. And so it did go on. So one of the regrets I have as a director is that we didn't build that strong foundation that would have, because we weren't building an organization. But I do think it's a wonderful model that a lot of people can use. And I always liked that 4-prong approach. And I think a lot of people on this call were involved in some way, shape, or form. So many people supported this. I think it's important for a community to take a look at their worldview. Where are we worldview of? We wanted a view of harmony, not in a sense that we all hold hands and buy each other a Coke and sing together, but that we're willing to work through tough conflict to get to the other side together. Not to diminish differences, but to appreciate all the differences and to end discrimination, prejudice, bias in any form, that we did not want to be a community that tolerated or increased that. So from an us and them community into a city of a community and a region of harmony.
As we discussed a little bit earlier, social justice is a big focus of a lot of the reasons behind emerging ecumenical and interfaith organizations. So I was wondering, what can interfaith organizations focused on anti-racism work learn from KC Harmony, and do you have any recommendations for how to continue this work in the future?
Like Larry said, maybe we're naive in the beginning, but I think I'm glad Larry was naive enough to do it. Sometimes if we know what we're getting into, we might not start. So I don't think I slept for 18 months. I do think that when we bring people across differences together, and we have a process for them to work through conflicts, to set a vision together, that to me is very exciting, to have that wide, diverse group of people, and that this is community-based. There was a national component through a world of difference, but this was community-based and involved all the community in very innovative ways. If we found a part of the community we weren't touching, we would innovate a new way to do that, and we were constantly innovating in that. And I think every community needs to have some process to bring people together, and also right now I'm finding people do not have the skills to work cross-culturally. They don't have the communication skills, they don't have the knowledge and background, and so huge amounts of conflicts are happening. So I would love to see in every community this a similar kind of harmony project embedded in the human relations department or somewhere in the city where you could turn to, you could turn to people that have the skill and expertise to come advise and look at systemic pieces of organizations to convene, to not always have to reinvent the wheel through nonprofits. I think that's real important.
Great. Well, Maggie, thank you so much for sharing today and working with us through some of those interruptions. I really appreciate you pointing out the project-based nature of some of these things. I think that's something we can often miss, that we don't have to create an institution that needs to stand alone for 50 years, but we can be specific with meeting needs in our communities with intentional efforts that are project-based. That's a great thing that I think gets missed frequently. So our next panelist is Donna Ziegenhorn. Donna Woodard Ziegenhorn is a playwright and journalist. As a playwright, she focuses on non-traditional plays inspired by true stories collected in interviews. These plays bring forth life-shaping experiences of diverse individuals to dramatic performance. The Hindu and the Cowboy, which has been recognized by Harvard's Pluralism Project for its unique contribution to building an inclusive community, grew from stories shared by people of numerous cultural and faith traditions across metropolitan Kansas City. The play has been seen by thousands of Kansas Cityans in venues that range from public libraries to university stages, corporate training auditoriums to high school gymnasiums and interfaith conferences to stages beyond Kansas City. Donna and the Hindu and the Cowboy have received awards from the Crescent Peace Society, the Greater Kansas City Interfaith Council, Missouri Association for Social Work, and the Dialogue Institute of the Southwest.
Thanks, Josh. So as mentioned, Donna, you developed the play, The Hindu and the Cowboy, which was later showcased in many interfaith events, including the Kansas City Festival of Faiths. What was your intention behind this project, and what did you hope to accomplish?
First I want to say it's really an honor to be part of this group. And as I've listened to the three other panelists talk and your presentation, Geneva, it's so fascinating to see how we all build off of each other and how we've touched in different places, and to be part of this 100-year sweep of history is quite something to think about. So thank you for the incredible service you've done by trying to pull things together. The Hindu and the Cowboy, as Josh was saying, it's a one-act play. And it grew out of the stories and lives lived of people from all different faith traditions in Kansas City, like Vern likes to say, from A to Z. And I want to say something about how it came about. It is based on a core conviction that on the power of story, and that is that when we as human beings from different walks of lives can share what we have lived. I mean, the experiences that have shaped us. And I'm not talking about necessarily our faiths, about what we believe and what our dogma is, but what have we viscerally experienced in our lives reaches across all boundaries. And because of that, we can connect on a deep human level that can change things within us and maybe shift around our perspectives and cause us to reconsider some of our previous views. So that was the concept that undergirded this project. And it was an attempt to get to that level of depth with people in interviews, and we weren't about collecting the stories of people that were all, I think, like Maggie was saying, all happy stories and happy clappy stories. No, they were the stories of what people had actually lived and survived, and what had affected them most deeply. Vern mentioned the enormous impact of 9/11, and I think culturally, as a society across the nation, it was such a wake-up call about the little that the dominant culture knew about the incredible diversity that we had, that we didn't know about. And that there was an imperative that we needed to get ourselves educated, we needed to get exposed, we needed to put ourselves out there. And it was because of the energy that was sprung from the Gifts of Pluralism project, that conference that gave birth to what would become the Hindu and the Cowboy. One of the things you saw in the pictures that Vern presented of the conference was the diversity we have present in Kansas City. And I think it's a surprise to a lot of people. We didn't know how diverse we were in terms of the face that were represented here. And so a big part of the idea, the vision in the Hindu and behind the Hindu and the Cowboy was to shift the perspective of who we, Kansas City, are as a community. We like to talk about it as a way to meet neighbors that you never knew before, by presenting these individuals from different traditions in one play. And so I think that was a big part of the vision, was to expose what we already have here, and to open people up to that reality. The process of the Hindu and the Cowboy was phenomenal. I think really a reason for its success was it was what I like to call community of, by, and for the people. It grew up out of the community. It was very grassroots, very local, kind of a hybrid form of theater that stood up story vignettes with the belief that they would speak. There was a attempt across the board to not, there was no judgment, no effort to censor or explain, but just to stand the stories up and let them speak. This involved a process of many people who went out to interview others, and I know some of them are in this audience right now. And there were more than 100 people that were interviewed in this process. And the play first had its premiere in 2004 at the Harmony Interfaith Luncheon Conference. And so that was in 2004. And from there, it took root and grew and expanded. And I do want to talk about the Festival of Faith's role in just a minute. But I will say that the play was designed with the idea that it would be mobile, it could travel anywhere, it could be presented in a high school gym, or it could be presented in a sophisticated theater, that it would be an hour or under, so that it could fit into a program slot. And another aspect of it, which I feel it still was key to the success of it, it depended on a theatrical producing organization, which was Metropolitan Ensemble Theater, who would be responsible for the production quality, getting the actors. It was a paid production. And that meant that we had to develop sponsors and partnerships throughout the community. And that was another aspect of what made it so, I think, community-wide. One of our many sponsors was the Kansas City Public Library System. And we had a number of performances at the Truman Library Forum in the Plaza. And that brought in an audience that had not traditionally been exposed to a lot of interfaith activity. So I want to skip now because in 2007, the Festival of Faith was launched. And it and the Hindu and the Cowboy became integrally related. And I have to say, a disclaimer, I was part of the Festival of Faith organizing committee too. And as I said, it started in 2007, and it was sparked by the visit that Diana Eck from Harvard made to Village Presbyterian Church. So you begin to see how these organizations and names kind of weave in and out of one another. But the Festival of Faith, after doing a couple of years study, because it didn't want to reinvent the wheel, and was looking at Kansas City to see what are the opportunities for interfaith connection that are available. And what we saw was that Kansas City had an enormous number of interfaith opportunities for people. And so we were twofold in our goals for the Festival of Faith. One was we wanted to highlight all the rich interfaith opportunities that existed already across the metropolitan area. And the second thing was we wanted to broaden the base of people that were participating in interfaith activities. And I think all of us who have been involved in this sphere know that often you can feel like you're preaching to the choir, and it's a real challenge to branch out and to widen the participation. So the strategy that the Festival of Faith used to get wider involvement was to bring in a big name speaker every year that we promoted heavily. And some of them, the first year was the Grandfather's Dialogue, Akbar Ahmed, and the father of Daniel Pearl, who had been, whose son had been executed as a journalist. And that was very widely attended. And we really evolved over the years in terms of what was a religious program and ending up with something I thought was just really creative and amazing. Our last presentation was by Jill Bolte Taylor, who some of you may have known was a physician who experienced a great stroke, and who and a scientist, a neurologist, and how she experienced the sacred, if you will, Vern, the sacred in her recovery, and what she had learned about the sacred relative to brain chemistry. So, I mean, we had a wide gamut of things that we were looking at. We did, I want to say one more thing, I'm probably talking too long. We did research. Every time we did a program, we did audience research to find out who was coming, how many, what their history was in terms of interfaith. So we had a category for first time. This is the first time I've ever attended an interfaith event. And so we called those people the Interfaith Virgins. And we tracked them, and we found that that in the Hindu and the Cowboy, when we gave performances at public venues like the library, we did attract a much broader audience. We attracted, I don't have the percentages handy, but of Interfaith Virgins. We found it was still a challenge to attract a younger audience in terms of participation in the speaker events. We were able to have the Hindu and the Cowboy produced in a number of high schools, but they were private high schools. Maybe this is a good time to stop and have you ask me a question.
Thanks, Donna. The Hindu and the Cowboy and the Kansas City Festival of Faiths are both unique in the fact that they use the arts as a mechanism to advance interreligious understanding. So did you find that this approach was more effective than some of the more traditional formats of interfaith dialogue? And if so, why?
I don't see it as more effective. I see it as hitting on a different aspect of human makeup. There's something about the possibility of human story, of witnessing another human being's inner life that has an impact that many times a scholarly discussion or even a comparison or discussion or dialogue about the differences in religious beliefs per se does not necessarily hit on the same level. I think, and I do like to distinguish, I mean, my perspective is about performance, stories in performance, which is different than reading stories, which has its benefit too. But for me, the performance aspect is critically essential because it puts the audience member in a different place than an ongoing dialogue. As an audience member, you're there to take in the story. And there's a certain kind of protection in a way. As an audience member, you're interacting with one-on-one another human being, but it's an internal process that you're doing. So there's no demand on you in terms of how do I react, or now what do I say, or no, it's not that. It's an emotional incorporation of somebody else's experience, and in all likelihood, it's an experience that you know something about too. And so it's different. It's an image changer. It's a perspective changer. So many times after the Hindu and the Cowboy, people would say, "Oh my gosh, number one, I had no idea we had that kind of diversity in Kansas City." But people would say, "Oh, that just gives me a whole different skew, a different way of seeing things." And other panelists will have ideas about that too, but for me, it's just a very powerful, and it's an essential part of bringing people together across boundaries that go deep down to the same common river.
Thank you, Donna. And a similar thread, do you have any thoughts or recommendations for how we might advance the use of the arts to promote interfaith understanding in the future?
I think, number one, I think that, just as I was saying, this is the Hindu and the Cowboy being of, by, and for the community. I think that as many people and diverse folks as you can get involved in creating and part of the whole process of building a performance opportunity, the better off you are. I would say one disappointment I had about the Hindu and the Cowboy, which did affect, it was seen by more than 5,000 Kansas Cityans. I was disappointed we didn't really make any headway with public high schools. That was something and whether it was we just didn't have the capacity to put a focused effort on that. But, we just found that there was public school administrators were just gun shy about any program that had to do with religion, and that could have been the historic time. But I don't know what that says. I mean, I think that there is such a need for exposure from younger people. And of course, the schools are the most obvious way to get there. So I would have an advanced plan for what your distribution plan is and how you're going to make that happen. I also would say, and I think this is a challenge for any interfaith work going forward, is what is the new umbrella title? You talked about at the beginning that there was ecumenism or ecumenical work, and now there's interfaith work. Well, what's the next work? Because we're living in a time of huge change when it comes to religion, religious practice, religious, the definition of religion. And you read the studies. What is the next thing? I don't think that interfaith is a big enough category, but I don't know what it is. I know that the fear is losing wisdom, and I think, Vern, this is where your three kinds of religion really come in. How do you preserve the wisdom of the world's religious traditions moving forward? Because there's going to be a lot of new emanations of religion that we don't see yet, and some that we do.
Well, Donna, thank you so much for sharing with us. I do want to be a good steward of our time and note that we're almost 20 minutes over, but this has been great information to pack 100 years in and to get through, some of our modern internet challenges. So thank you all for your patience with that. I think this was a great event. Respecting one another's time, we'll probably pass on the Q&A effort this time around, but I certainly hope we can continue engaging one another on these themes and sort of picking up where things may have dropped the ball in the past and certainly initiating new programming. So I think this has been a wonderful event. Thank you all for your participation, and I hope everyone has a great rest of your Sunday afternoon.